Our guests on today's Touch Basin's Hole are two of the most renowned translators in Korean literature, with a back catalogue of translations going back 40 years. If you have any interest in Korean literature, you will likely have heard their names, Bruce and Ju-chan Fulton. Together they have introduced to English readers the works of beloved Korean writers including Hwang Sun-won, Jo Jung-rae and Hwang Seok-young. Last year, another one of their projects was published, and it was Kim Sun's One Left, telling the story of a woman who was kidnapped into a life as a comfort woman. I'm delighted to say that we connect with them both now. Hello, Mr. and Mrs. Fulton.
Hello.
Thank you for connecting with us today, especially as our inaugural guests using our video call system, which we are trying out for the first time on Korea24. Our listeners can see this interview on our KBS World Radio YouTube page, which we will be uploading shortly. So, Mr. and Mrs. Fulton, many of our listeners will be familiar with your works, but can you briefly introduce yourselves to our listeners and viewers?
Well, my name is Bruce Fulton, and in 1978, February of 1978, I arrived in Korea as a U.S. Peace Corps volunteer. And that summer, I was fortunate to meet Ju-chan, who was a co-teacher of a fellow Peace Corps volunteer in my group. And the following year, we were married. And at the end of that year, we returned to the U.S. And already by then, we had begun translating a collection of stories. And we've been translating, working together ever since.
Right, so a beautiful personal and professional relationship blossomed then. How did that start? What was it like? Mrs. Fulton, let me get your perspective. When you two started doing translations, what was that like?
Well, it was fun because our beginning was with Hwang Sun-won, and he was a fun guy, and he had such a inquisitive eyes, always checking. And so it was fun, and our personal relationship with him, as well as working relationship, was a supreme, high level.
And what is your process working together like? Do you ever have any disagreements?
Well, that's our working process has varied over the years depending on the time that's available to us. Ju-chan worked for full time for the airlines until 2011. And for my part, I was a freelancer until 1999 when I began teaching at the University of British Columbia. So in the beginning, I was the one who had more time at home and would do a first draft looking at the Korean original, which Ju-chan would annotate, and then we would work on it together. But these days, I'm teaching full-time at Zoom University, as the University of British Columbia students refer to their university. And Ju-chan often will draft a first English version, and we will then take it from there. But always at the end of the process, I will read the translation aloud, and Ju-chan will follow in the Korean original. And that way we get a sense of how the translation sounds, how it's going to sound to readers as they read it silently. And of course, if there are any last minute problems or mistranslations, Ju-chan can pick them up at that time.
Sure. There are countless works that you've translated over the years that we could talk about, but we wanted today to talk about the work that you published in September last year, which is now set for its second printing already. It's the novel One Left by Kim Sun, a powerful and harrowing book about victims of Japanese wartime sex slavery, euphemistically known as, of course, comfort women. How did you come to choose this work, and how do you choose works in general to translate?
So Kim Sun's literary quality, first we discussed because she is a very powerful writer. And we could hear the girls' voices. And she is also very imaginative and beautifully written paragraphs.
Mm.
And we like that. And number two is that, of course, it's the first novel focused on comfort woman's legacy and by Korean author. And we thought she is awfully brave, and her message is very simple, and she wants to shed their shame and guilt
Mm.
and raise their dignity. And so we decided we will go along with her message
Mm.
and we will help her to do that.
Right, Mr. Fulton, what do you
In
think that message was? What do you think Kim Sun was trying to convey with her novel? And what were you trying to convey with your translation as well?
Well, what Kim Sum did not want to do was to get embroiled in Japan bashing and to get involved in international conflict. What she did want to do was to restore these 200,000 plus girls, and girls is what they were when they were taken away. She wants to restore them to historical memory with an ultimate goal of healing and of closure. If I could digress very briefly, there's a novel by Hwang Suk-young called Sonnim, or The Guest, in which the the souls, the victims, the specters of a massacre that took place in Shinshan, Hwanghae Province, North Korea, they Hwang Suk-young brings their voices back, and in that way they can tell their story very dispassionate. And then, as in a traditional spiritual gut ceremony, they're allowed, by having told their stories, to reach closure and healing and go to their final resting place.
Mm.
And in a way, this is what Kim Sum is trying to do. She's trying to retrieve a part of Korean history that has been consigned to oblivion and bring back these 200,000 plus women, and she uses their testimony so that what we read in the flashbacks of this novel are the voices. We can hear the voices of these girls telling us what they experienced, telling us how they were misled or how they were abducted, and telling us about how they found solidarity among themselves at the comfort station.
Mm.
So Kim Sum is asking us to read the stories of these women, to think of them as our sisters, our mothers, our grandmothers, our next door neighbors, and to remember them as individuals who existed, who had a life, instead of burying them in oblivion.
Well, clearly from your description, we can tell that it's a very compelling and important work. But I understand, I heard in some previous interviews that it wasn't easy finding a publisher for this book. Can you tell us why that was?
That was what we did not expect. It was 32 publishers. I think,
32.
first of all, 32.
Wow.
Imagine that. We got very old during those 2 years.
Wow. Yes, I can
We
imagine.
once we were young. Okay, so I think the publishers in US, they were very confused. They were thinking whether primarily is this historical or this is fiction. And I think number two is that the topics very sensitive issue, and someone have to be very courageous to publish this. And number three, we were really lamenting that how small Korea is in the world stage. Although we have all this popular culture,
Mm.
방탄소년단, all the Korean movies and all that, but Korea is relatively low, and their visibility is very little in the world stage in literature, and high level of, you know, culture and all those things that we need really work on.
Sure. So there was a long road for it to be published in English, but then what was the response like once it was published?
Well, in U.S., I have to be very straightforward for you. In U.S., it says it's a very powerful and necessary novel
Hmm.
and courageous writer and translator. That's U.S. Korea did not have any response up until Ramjer controversy erupted. I were very upset. I contacted Yonhap news agency in New York, and that's the time they realized, oh, we've got to do something, and that's why this article came out, and that's why you got to know about One Left. Thank you.
Sure, of course. Ramsey is the controversial professor at Harvard who wrote a very controversial paper about the comfort women in Korea, one which we don't really have time to get into today. You mentioned that there was a question mark whether this book was fiction or whether it was factual. Where do you think it lies?
Well, it's
Because
definitely a work of fiction, but what Kim Sum has done, and this is the brilliance of this novel, in choosing a narrative style, she sets the present of the novel. The protagonist is a undeclared, unreported, unregistered woman in her early 90s living in a neighborhood in present day Seoul that is slated for Jegebao reconstruction. But the past of the novel, and about two-thirds of the novel consists of flashbacks, is based on the testimony of the grandmothers, as they're affectionately called. And Kim Sum has provided us with more than 300 endnotes, which identify the sources, the books, the TV programs, the broadcasts, and that combination of factual testimony and imaginative setting of the 91-year-old protagonist in present day Seoul uh, succeeds in bringing us the human historical element of the novel in a setting that is easily recognizable by anyone in the Seoul metropolitan area, knowing that Seoul is always evolving. But what Kim Sum has done by situating the protagonist in a redeveloping neighborhood in which most of the people have moved out is she is showing us that the narrator continues to live a kind of shadow existence. No one in her family knows about her past. Her friends don't know about her past, but from this vantage point, she can reflect back on her experiences 70 years ago.
Unfortunately, we only have time to briefly touch upon this one book today because you have, as we said, a whole history of works over 4 decades that we could talk about today. But if we just try to wrap up, during your 40 years of translating Korean literature, what changes have you seen in the literary scene during that time, and what has stuck with you?
This is a question that could take about an hour to answer, but I think I could answer it with one word: commercialization. And we do not regard that as a positive force. But if I may switch to our future, I'm happy to mention that I with the late Kevin O'Rourke, who passed away a few months ago, were able to get an anthology of modern Korean stories accepted by Penguin England. And this will be a counterpart to the Penguin Book of Modern Japanese Stories, and I'm very happy to say that the Penguin Book of Modern Korean Stories is slated for publication toward the end of this year. So that is how I would like to end our
Sure.
session.
Mrs. Fulton, you must be very excited about that as well.
You must be very excited as well.
Yes, I am. Yeah. I think we will have a better news at the end of this year. So
Sure.
you call us.
Sure, definitely. We'd love to have you back on the show again because I think there's so much more to talk about. Unfortunately, we have to end it there for today, but it's been an absolute pleasure. We've been speaking to literary translators Bruce and Juchan Fulton. Thank you both for your time today.
Thank you. Our pleasure.